Hello, I'm Mark Tucker,
And I'm Alan Furstenberg, and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs.
How's it been going
Hey,
for you, Mark?
it's been going fine. It's been a while. I wasn't on last week. We had a great co-host guest in Alarna. Did a
Ilarna
great
did do
job.
Ilarna did do a fantastic job. We've got an email saying how much they liked her presence, but also email asking, making sure you were going to return. So you had
Oh, that's
there
nice.
was some
Yeah,
concern
no,
out there.
I'm still here.
No, so I think Ilarna was our first trial to see how guest hosting would do, and I think it went well. So we're hoping to get more guest hosts on in the future to get a nice broad range of perspectives.
Yeah, sometimes it will be Alan that's taking a week off, and sometimes it will be me. So that sounds good. Yeah, no, great job. Looking forward to other developers that we can get on and learn their perspective and their experience or their story, any of that. So, uh,
So if there's someone you would like to, people would like to see
yeah,
on, we're open ears. We're
or
looking
if you want to be
for anyone
on,
who wants to talk.
let us know. Yeah, definitely. So, what do you do, Alan, when you're in your code and things just aren't quite working right?
Ah, so we're talking about debugging,
Oh, yes.
the bane of every developer's existence.
Yeah, there's the the good and the bad, right, with development, and there's a lot of fun parts, and sometimes tracking down a problem via debugging is fun, and sometimes when it lasts for a couple of days, it's not so fun. But um,
Yep.
yeah, so I don't know, let's talk about some of the things that we do, maybe some of the tools that we use, or just strategies, whatever. I don't know, whatever comes up.
You know, one of the toughest parts is that certainly for the way skills and actions work, they're running on a server. So you can't just, attach a debugger to them and step through the code step by step. And you need to return in like 5 or 7 seconds. So you can't freeze on a line and stare at it and contemplate it and query for variables because suddenly everything will stop working. And so, no, it's tough. Debugging skills and actions can be a challenge.
And so let's make sure that we know what we're talking about. So I develop in JavaScript, and you typically develop.
Mostly in JavaScript as well.
Okay.
So we're playing from the same playbook here.
All right. So that's good. So maybe we can pass on some tips. One of the things that I guess most people know that I've used Jovo quite a bit in development for cross-platform stuff, and there is a Jovo CLI that comes with well, I guess two things, a debugger and a proxy. So if you've used
Ooh.
something like ngrok, where you can expose your local machine publicly on the internet, because that's what you would have to do in some cases to debug things locally, is make it look like to Alexa that this thing is just a regular service out there, but then it's actually being redirected down to your box. Well, that's baked in with the Jovo CLI. So if you do Jovo run, and you then you can have a built-in proxy that goes to that. Plus, in the middle of that proxy, Jovo has added a web page that they call the debugger. So it records all your requests and your responses and gives you a nice view into just the conversation flow, but also what the state is, what the request looks like, what the response is, what values are in session state, what values are in the database. So very tight, nice integration, which helps quite a bit.
No, I can see how that's very helpful. I know that ngrok also has similar pages, and that just shows
Mm-hmm.
request and response, though. It doesn't show database state, except in Google, it can show the session state, the user state, other stuff that's in there, but that's because it's part of the session.
Right. So that's it's interesting. So basically, Jovo took ngrok and then added some features that were voice specific features.
Yeah, plussed it up a bit. No, that's useful. I know, but I know one of the things that I do a lot, and I'm sure you do it a lot too, because I think everyone does this, is the simple old console log, right?
Yes.
Where we just start littering our code with console log all over the place. And since we're dealing with objects, we need to start printing, we need to JSON stringify them, and that starts turning into a mess, right?
Yeah, it definitely can, and if you just do a console log everywhere, then that's always in your code. There's a library that I use that allows me to expose different log levels. So I can turn on through an environment variable if I want to do things like tracing or debug level, where maybe I'll get into some details. Like if I get a response back from an API call, I'll log that, or the request object that's being passed in. So that's detail that when I want to flip on the switch and go all the way down into debug mode, then I'll get that detail. But then there's other just higher level informational things that I may not log as much detail, but I could still have that, good old CloudWatch for those that are hosting their code in Lambda.
Mm-hmm.
I can go into CloudWatch and do a search for things there.
Right, and that's particularly useful when you're running it, when you've got it in production and you start getting reports that there are problems, because then we can turn those things on and start monitoring them a little bit closer.
Yeah, for those intermittent things, that's problematic though, because you either just leave it on for a while and
get huge logs.
get huge logs and find it. One of the things that I do that I've started doing is that there is a company out there called Sentry IO, and they do like exception logging. And so I'll add that into my project and keep that live. So whenever there's an unhandled exception, or I can even, there's certain times where when I explicitly write out a log of a certain situation happens, then it shows up in the console for Sentry. So then I don't necessarily have to go back into or like do all the console log stuff. It captures a stack trace and some other things, and it starts grouping things together. So if I see a problem over and over again, then I start getting some additional information and I can go in and actually fix it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do as well is I have part of one of the things that multivocal lets me do is it lets me run functions after I've returned the code. So it can take a little bit extra time to do things. I don't need to worry about getting everything done on a time-sensitive budget.
Yeah.
So what I do is I've set it up so that it takes a number of the things that have been computed during an exchange and logs them to Google Bigtable. And included in that are things like what intent was triggered, what action was triggered by that intent, what scene were we in if we're an action builder, what outent did we use, which choice did we pick, and which user ID was it, a bunch of other additional information, none of it PII, but all of it that I can log, so that later if someone comes to me and says, hey, I tried using this yesterday around 3 o'clock and it didn't work, I can say, oh, well, let me go pull up your session and see what the values were at each stage and what was happening. And I can say, well, you said no, and this is what happened. And I know what you said because I logged what you said.
Yeah, you get the extra advantage on Google that you actually know exactly what they said, as opposed to on Alexa at least what the intent was that got matched in slot values. Yeah, but
regardless, you get
helpful.
the intent, and that's useful to know, because it's the intent that is changing the state.
Yep.
So you get to see how does the state progress at each level, and how did we get to where we ended up that's causing the problem.
Yeah, no, definitely helpful to be able to get into that detail. Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about Bigtable. What is that?
Bigtable is, it's one of Google's first products. It's really just I guess nowadays we would call it a data lake or something like that. But basically it's meant as a database where you are mostly writing data or querying data, and you're doing very little data manipulation.
Okay.
So it's meant to just dump data into it. Their analytics product uses Bigtable behind the scenes.
Okay.
And that's really mostly what it's meant for, is so you can dump a bunch of stuff there and then just filter based on various parameters in it. I do the same logging that goes to, I forget what Google calls it now because they changed the name a bunch of times. But basically, they've got a product that is specific for logging. It might even be called cloud logging now, where you just dump a bunch of parameters and then can query and say, show me all of the events that match these parameters.
Right.
And it'll say, here's, for the past 3 hours, and it'll show them. And then you can say, well, give me more info on this one. Show me all of these parameters for this event.
No, that's interesting. What I've started doing, because I do CloudWatch, and I do look in CloudWatch, and that's, that could be good or bad. If it's during a particular time where only one person's using it, then you get a pretty straight flow. But if multiple people are hitting it fairly close to the same time, then you get their logs intermixed with
Right.
other logs, and so then you have to try to find kind of what the common GUID is that links that session, and then try to find all the things that are in that session. But I didn't want to mix in Google responses with Bixby responses with Alexa responses, and so I actually on purpose set up 3 different Lambdas, even though they're running the exact same code. Then I've got one instance that just handles all Google requests, and it can scale as it needs to with how many users we have on Google. Same with Alexa. So that way, at least everything's like type in CloudWatch.
Yeah, it lets you filter it down a little bit.
Yeah. So then when I'm searching something, then at least I know I'm kind of dealing with all the same type of data. It was getting a little unwieldy when I just had everything in the same CloudWatch log.
I figure when I start getting to that point, one of the parameters I will end up logging is what platform it is, and then I can just filter based on platform equaling or not equaling something.
Yeah, that's good. So we've got being able to run code locally and with ngrok or some other way of directing things down, and it actually runs pretty good on local machine, because with Visual Studio Code I can set breakpoints, I can attach to the process, and so I can at least get into the request. Now maybe the rest of the stuff fails as far as the request, but then I can still debug and step into my logic, whether it be calling something in a database or an API or something, and then checking the responses or different things. So that's helpful.
Now here's a slightly leading question for you.
Yeah.
Do you usually set up tests for your code?
It depends. On some projects I've been very good at writing unit tests. And
yes, so I'm still absolutely thrilled and in awe of the fact that Speech Markdown had fantastic tests.
Thank you. And actually one of my voice games had tests. And so it's interesting. It definitely takes more work, and you have to set things up with with different tools. I'm trying to remember the names now. But just basically just JavaScript testing tools. And then being able to write code in such a way that inside of my handlers, I don't call APIs directly. I wrap them in things that I call services. And so then I could mock out services and return, specify what the data is that's going to come back from those. And so then I can write tests that run through and test the handlers, the code in the handlers, without having to make API calls out to things or change things in the database or whatnot. Mm-hmm. So that's been helpful, mocking things out. So that's been a helpful.
One of the interesting things is that Google recently released a test library for the assistant. So it literally what it does is it makes assistant calls. So it's acting like it was an assistant. So you can say things like, start a session, say this, check to see if the response was one of these 5 or 6 different strings, because you can have multiple responses. Check to see if the session state contains this value. Then say this, and then check all of these things. Then say this, check all of these things.
So is it actually running, or is it just simulating
No, it's
that
actually
it's
running. It's making a network call to the assistant.
interesting?
And the library, although the test library itself is meant to be used for testing, it's basically, it contains a bunch of stuff to assist with the examining the results and verifying the results. It's built on top of a library that is just meant to call the assistant. So you could, in
Interesting.
theory, embed the assistant in anything using this, in theory.
In theory. Well, that's interesting because what I use for unit testing is Bespoken tools. They have a library that, the same type of thing you issue. This is you're going to send this intent, and sometimes you can get away with just this is the string that you would say, and sometimes you need to actually code the intent and specify which slots that you're passing. But then you get back an object that then is the response. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't actually make the call, so you're not really running
Oh,
your
interesting.
NLU. But what it does is it's able to figure out based on your different lists of utterances and how they map to intents what's being called, and then it's able to simulate making those calls into those handlers. So very, very useful and a great library. They have a version for both Alexa and Google Assistant, so it can simulate either.
And that's
And
from
so then
Bespoken,
then
right?
you just use your Mocha and your chai. See, I remembered uh, to do your unit testing. There also are some I guess kind of scripting or YAML based testing where you can set up, you call this and this is what you expect to get back.
I have seen some of that, and I can't remember who the platforms are, though.
Yeah, so Bespoken has kind of a next level tool, which is more of their integration testing, where you're actually are going to make calls against um, a version of the assistant or the Alexa skill and execute things. And then that turns into the ability to set up certain tests that you run periodically. So now you're monitoring your skills and your actions to make sure that they're running on a regular basis or that they're behaving like you expect. And then you go into the kind of the full-blown robot that Bespoken has, where it actually is recording a device and has
yeah.
a speaker and a microphone, and it's recording screen captures and taking audio and doing text to speech to get the transcript of the interaction. So that's another interesting. But they cover all the way from unit testing all the way up to this test robot that tests any device that you have. It just treats it like it's just a kind of a testing environment.
So that's interesting. I knew about their more advanced stuff. I didn't know about their simpler testing tools.
Yeah, so if you guys are just getting into testing things, definitely check out Bespoken. There's a number of good articles out there, or just hit up John Kelvey or others on Twitter. Sure, he or Emerson or anybody else would be happy to get you going on looking into Bespoken and what to do with that.
And despite all that, we still have trouble testing this stuff, don't we?
It can definitely be a challenge. It is interesting writing tests for that, because you might have variability in your response. So let's say that I've got some translations that come back and maybe it's welcome is the name of the text, but I set it up as an array where it picks up a number of different values. So it could be welcome back, welcome Mark, I'm glad to see you. It could be lots of different things. And so there's a number of different ways that you can tackle that. One way is that you set up some regular expressions or something to try to figure out, here is a list of possible things that it could say, or fragments that would indicate that you've got the right thing going. But interestingly enough, the approach that I take is I basically turn off, just for the unit tests, the actual translations. And so what it does is it gives you back the key that it's going to use to look up the stuff. And so then I just check to see if the response includes this key. It might include multiple keys, But then I just can, check to see if the string coming back includes this key that I'm looking for, which is usually all in uppercase. And then I'm like, oh, I got my welcome message.
See, so that's interesting. So the latest version of multivocal, I made some stuff that was meant to work well with the new testing library, Google's new testing library. So one of the things that it can do, if you flip debug on, is it will now let you specify additional values that you want to send back as part of the session response in a special debug set.
Ooh.
So once you do that, it also includes which intent was replied, which outtent was used, which set of those responses it could be, and which one of the responses was selected. So if you've got a list of 5 or 6, it'll tell you, so I chose from this response set, I chose number 4 this time.
Okay.
So now you can just test, okay, it's response set, outtent error.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
But what it also lets you do is this now, and this is not something that I give you the direct ability to do, but it now lets you run it multiple times to make sure you have full coverage.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because there is certainly the possibility that you've created a response that could throw an error.
Yes, that is possible.
So this makes sure it doesn't make sure, but it now gives you a way to, if you need to or want to, check all the, make sure you've checked all the responses, or at least know that you didn't check some response.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So once you start getting into unit testing, then the next step is to plug in a report that checks your code to see what kind of code coverage you have, and so then you start to see, oh, I don't have very good code coverage in this area. So then you try to figure out either a way to refactor or redesign it, or add tests, or be okay with the fact that there aren't tests in that area. But
right, and what this also lets you do is make sure that the values that you're using that go into the response. So for example, if you say you have 5 oranges, well, the 5 and the oranges are 2 separate values.
Yes.
That you want to test to make sure those values are set correctly. And doing that as part of string testing just becomes a pain.
Yeah, something else that I've done in my code, which is I have an environment variable that lets you know if you're unit testing or not. So it's only set on the console, and so because the Bespoken tool, you can set up a request and then you get a response back, and you can check what's in the response, what's in the output text or other things. But there might be times when you're doing tests where you want to set up a certain scenario where the code's in a certain position, and it's hard to do that. You don't want to necessarily have to do that by going through every request. I want to go to this intent, which calls this intent, which sets this value, which calls this intent. You want to set up a situation where you're just setting things. Well, you don't have access to the Jovo object, which has a lot of goodness on it inside of those tests. And so what I've done is at the beginning of each of my handlers, then I have a little piece of code that I run, which behind the scenes, it checks to see if it's that's in local test mode. And if it is, then there's actually a null handler, just a null function that it calls, a callback that just doesn't do anything. But I can, inside my test, I can get access to that. I kind of intercept that function call, and then I can return back. I get access to the Jovo object, so I can set values in the session or user storage or other things that I need. And then I run my test. So then I really have access to tweak my test. I'm in exactly this position. And so now I'm going to test what the response is in that position. And that helps quite a bit.
That makes sense. Yeah. I think a lot of what this is telling me is that testing and debugging are a lot harder in voice than they are in other environments.
Yeah, there are definitely more moving parts.
Yeah,
in some cases you just get the request and the response, and you have to get creative on figuring out. There's multiple rounds or ways that I finally got to the part where what I'm doing now, and that seems to work reasonably well just by adding extra code at the beginning. But what that goes to show of like if you're doing something like TypeScript, which has this concept of aspects where you can decorate different functions with some sort of a thing that's going to get called. You actually get access to the function, and you say, oh, this function's been decorated with this aspect. Then you could maybe do additional things easier. I don't use a lot of TypeScript, but I have done some aspects for some different things just to prove the concept out, and that's also something that you could do.
That's a good point.
But there's lots of different tools. One of the reasons why I use like Mocha and Chai over something like Jest is that my understanding anyway, or at least my experience has been that Jest runs lots of things in parallel. But sometimes I want to just get down to, I don't want to run all my unit tests. I want to run just this particular unit test that I'm working on. And so I can decorate just that test with a label that lets me just execute just that one. And so it's interesting because then I can run the unit test and I can set a breakpoint and just debug right into that unit test sometimes to debug my unit tests.
See, and I think running in parallel runs certainly the problem that the advantage to running in parallel sometimes, and this is sometimes, is one of the bugs I see a lot of people doing is they accidentally slip in global variables into their designs, or I've probably done it a dozen times and not realized it until two people try calling it at the same time and you're getting other people's sessions.
Yeah.
And that's
true.
That's a big problem.
So that would be something that you could find like in a Jest where it was running parallel tests. You run it and everything works fine, and then you run it again without any changes and it breaks. You're like, okay, something's out of sequence, and you're like, okay, that's a problem in itself.
I think of all the problems I've seen, usually it's people who are new to web-based programming because they're the web server side, because they're not used to the notion that you're running in an environment where lots of people's code can be running at the same time.
Right. Well, and it did take me a while at the beginning to think, okay, this particular code is being hosted in an instance of Lambda, and it could be running my code and it could be running somebody else's code, flip-flopping in between turns. So we could be synced up just right where my turn one is processed and somebody else's turn one is processed, and then my turn two, and then their turn two, and it's, so there, it really is stateless, and you have to do other things like session or storing things in user storage, or something really, else to make sure that you don't crash with other people's data.
Right. It really does take you having to think just a little bit to reframe how you think about scoped variables, because it's in some ways it's a very different scope than the traditional programming scopes we're used to.
Yeah. But there are times when, like, if maybe you have all your translations in an S3 bucket, and when the instance starts up, the instance in Lambda could be around for 20 minutes and it could be processing hundreds of different things, but those translations aren't going to change.
Right.
They're the same for everybody. So there is an improvement if you do it once when the whole process starts up, and then just keep using it.
Right. So. But it's still, these are, I guess we're going to have I think we should have another show on tricks like this.
Something else I do, I have just thought about it, is that also when I'm doing my Sentry IO stuff, you can set up Sentry if you there's a free version of Sentry, which is what I use. And if you are doing this professionally, then you can buy the professional version of it, which costs you some change. But it has the ability to not only log to the Sentry website, but it can notify you in various ways, one of them being Slack. Well, if you want to do the poor man's way of doing that, then I've written both, and there are plugins available if you do Jovo, but you could have both a Sentry plugin and a Slack plugin, where I have a certain channel set up for Slack, and then each of the different messages that come in our messages. So it would log not only to the Sentry, but also to Slack when there's an error. And I've set it up with environment variables to say if this is the debug version, then the color is, I don't know, orange. If it's the staging environment, then it's yellow. And if it's the production environments, it's red. And and then I can just watch my Slack channel, and when something happens, I'm like, oh, I got to go look at this. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So we would love to hear what like debugging tricks you have, what tools you use, whether it be on the unit testing or more of the integration testing side of things, or
how you handle bugs in production, and what you're doing for observability and similar tools like that.
Yeah, definitely would teach us what other things we haven't thought of everything, I'm sure, and you might just have an idea that we want to go ahead and implement it on our next project. So please share.
And until then, we are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Have a good rest of the week, Alan.
You too, Mark.
Thank you.